As we discovered in the last lecture, the earliest thinkers of Western philosophy failed to reach their goal, which was, in most cases, to provide an account of the whole. That is, to explain what all reality essentially is. For most of them, this meant identifying the fundamental element out of which all reality is composed, which they called the arche, and explaining how or why that fundamental element takes on so many forms and is subject to change. As we saw, this problem has aptly been called the problem of the one and the many. These early philosophers are often called pre-Socratic philosophers because of their place in history prior to Socrates, an Athenian citizen who was put to death by the city of Athens in 399 BC on charges of not believing in the gods and corrupting the youth. Although a great philosopher, Socrates did not write down his thoughts in books or essays, and so we're left to surmise what he believed through the writings of those who knew him best. Which brings us to the thought of his most famous student, Plato. Plato's most famous writings are dialogues, almost always featuring Socrates as the main speaker, conversing with someone or some group of people about a particular subject. In some of these dialogues, Socrates is content to ask questions and point out problems with the opinions of his interlocutors, and in others, he sets forth more explicitly his own philosophical ideas. One of Plato's works that gives us an especially enlightening window into the mind of its author, as well as that of Socrates himself, is a dialogue called the Theaetetus, which takes place just before Socrates' trial and death, and which concerns the very profound question of human knowledge. Before we look at the dialogue itself, we should recall that this is something that pre-Socratic philosophers had an especially difficult time explaining. For instance, remember Democritus's theory that all reality is composed of nothing but tiny atoms and the empty space between them, or what he called the void. Also remember that, according to this theory, the only way to understand or know something is to understand how the atoms making it up are arranged. There is no man, dog, cat, tree, mosquito, or swimming pool other than the tiny atoms that constitute these things. Likewise, human beings themselves are nothing but accidental conglomerations of atoms, which also means that any knowledge we might claim to have would also have to be some conglomeration or other of atoms inside our brains. And yet this is where the radical materialism of Democritus really seems to have problems. If we claim to have knowledge about something, that presupposes that our beliefs about it are true rather than false. And yet it makes no sense to say that some conglomeration of atoms in our brains are true or that someone else's are false. In fact, it doesn't even make sense to say that some conglomeration of atoms in our brains is about anything. They are just the arrangements that they are. Truth and falsity just don't apply to conglomerations of atoms or neurons any more than mass and density applies to numbers, geometrical figures, or beliefs. And yet, nevertheless, Democritus and his fellow atomists all the while claim that their beliefs are true, that atomism is true, even though their entire theory makes nonsense of the very idea of truth. With this philosophical background in mind, we may now look to the drama of Plato's Theaetetus, which is a story recounted by two men in the year 369 BC about a conversation that took place 30 years earlier between Socrates and a brilliant young mathematician named Theaetetus. Socrates is first introduced to Theaetetus by the young man's teacher, Theodorus, who boasts of the young man's remarkable intelligence. With his characteristic self-effacing irony, Socrates proceeds to ask young Theaetetus what it's like to be such a successful student, what it's like to learn things, as if to suggest that Socrates himself has never learned anything. When Theaetetus responds that learning something is essentially to gain knowledge, Socrates drops the $6 million question squarely in his lap. What is knowledge? It's clear that Theaetetus, though highly intelligent in mathematics, is not accustomed to discussing philosophical questions. His initial response to Socrates is merely to provide examples of knowledge, such as the knowledge of geometry or the knowledge of shoemaking and other similar crafts. But of course, Socrates isn't interested in examples of knowledge. He wants to know the definition of knowledge itself. In other words, what knowledge essentially is. Now, you might be wondering, why doesn't Socrates just tell Theaetetus what knowledge is, in the same way as his teacher Theodorus might simply explain the principles of mathematics and geometry? The clear implication is that Socrates is a very different kind of teacher than, say, Theodorus, and philosophical wisdom, the kind of wisdom for which Socrates is so well known, is not the same kind of wisdom as what Theaetetus is used to acquiring. In fact, the analogy Socrates uses to explain this difference is that of a midwife. Just as a midwife helps a pregnant woman deliver her child, so does Socrates likewise help to extract the truth out of those with whom he converses. And just as the midwife herself is not with child, so also Socrates himself possesses no knowledge either, but rather, through his questions, brings that knowledge out of others. Realizing the inadequacy of his initial response to the question, what is knowledge, Theaetetus finally gives his first definition of this difficult concept. As he says, knowledge is basically the same thing as perception. But as Socrates proceeds to point out almost immediately, this definition is fraught with difficulties. If knowledge is perception, that means that to perceive something is to know it. And yet we as human beings seem to misperceive things all the time. How could Theaetetus account, for example, of someone that hears another person speaking in a foreign language? Although he may perceive each syllable with perfect clarity, he might remain perfectly ignorant of what's being said, assuming he has no knowledge of the language. But perhaps Theaetetus meant something different in saying that knowledge is perception. Perhaps what he meant to say is that someone possesses knowledge when they perceive that something is true. In other words, when they form an opinion about something. So knowledge would just be to have a belief about something. This would mean then that knowledge is relative to each person's opinions or beliefs. On this theory of knowledge, it would make no sense to say that one person's opinions are true and another person's are false. One would be credited with knowledge merely for having an opinion at all. If you say that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and I say that 2 plus 2 equals 5, neither one of us would be right or wrong. We would just see things differently. Socrates, in fact, likens this perspective to a famous man by the name of Protagoras, who believes something very much like what Theaetetus is saying. According to Protagoras, man is the measure of all things, which means that there is no objective standard by which to judge anyone's opinions and beliefs, and therefore no possible way to say that one belief is true and another is false. All beliefs, in other words, are relative to each person's subjective viewpoint. This relativism means that even to speak of truth or falsehood is to miss the point entirely. There just is no such thing as truth. There are only my opinions and your opinions. In addition to associating these views with Protagoras, Socrates also likens them to the philosophy of Heraclitus. Remember that Heraclitus believed that everything is in flux, and if this is the case, it follows that nothing affirmative about reality can ever really be known or understood. Reality just makes one impression upon my mind and another on yours, but neither of us are in any position to say that our impressions are more accurate than anyone else's. They just are what they are. Truth, falsity, accuracy, inaccuracy, these are just words that have no meaning once the true nature of knowledge is understood. In the end, the views of Heraclitus, Protagoras, and Theaetetus converge. Man is the measure of all things, everything is in flux, knowledge is perception. These are all basically different ways of saying the same thing. Truth is relative to each individual perceiver. It does not take Socrates long to point out the problems with this radical form of relativism. As we noticed, Theaetetus' definition of knowledge eliminates the reality of objective truth. And yet, the very fact that he gives a definition at all presupposes the reality of objective truth, since he is proposing his own definition of knowledge as the true definition. In fact, this is ultimately the problem with all forms of relativism, all denials of objective truth. For to say the words, "There is no such thing as objective truth," is to propose something as objectively true. The minute one begins to defend a commitment to relativism, therefore, the case immediately falls apart, because relativism always undermines itself. It cannot stand up under its own weight. Fortunately, Theaetetus appears to understand this, and accordingly changes his definition of knowledge. Realizing that any definition of knowledge must include some reference to objective truth, he next argues that knowledge must be defined as true opinion. To be sure, this is an improvement upon the last definition, but Socrates soon shows that this one too has irredeemable problems. Most seriously, there is no means in the definition by which to distinguish opinions that actually constitute knowledge and those that just happen to be true accidentally. For example, two people may hold the opinion that a certain person is guilty of committing murder. One person may arrive at that opinion, however, by carefully considering the evidence, and thereby deducing the murderer's identity. Another person, on the other hand, may irrationally consider the murderer guilty merely on the basis of the killer's race or hair color. Both people may have opinions that are true, but only one of these people can be said to truly know something. The other's opinion, true though it may be, is based on nothing but blind prejudice. So Theaetetus' definition of knowledge needs to be revised again. Knowledge is not just true opinion, he says, but true opinion with an account. The Greek word for account here is a familiar one, logos. That is to say, an explanation or rational argument as to why one's opinion is true rather than false. To be sure, this is the best definition of knowledge yet. But what does it mean? It's at this point that the Theaetetus takes a very strange turn. Socrates, upon hearing Theaetetus' definition, compares it to a dream of his, in which he considered precisely this last theory of knowledge. According to his dream, the only way to know something is to understand it in terms of its component parts, the elements that constitute it. Although not mentioned here by name, this theory of knowledge is reminiscent of Democritus, who believed that all reality is nothing other than indivisible atoms and the empty space between them, what he called the void. On Democritus' view, then, the only way to know something is to break it down into those parts, to see how those parts are arranged, how they interact with one another, and so on. But what this also means, interestingly, is that the individual atoms themselves are unknowable. Why? Precisely because they can't be broken down into their own parts. Again, if the only way to know something is to break it down into smaller parts, which seems to be the central teaching of materialism, the most basic or elemental parts will be unknowable, precisely because they are indivisible. But follow to its conclusion, what this means is that no account of anything could ever ultimately be given, since our attempt to know something will always lead us down to the unknowable and unintelligible atoms of existence. On the assumption that all reality is reducible to some materialistic principle, therefore, the phenomenon of knowledge appears impossible to explain. Plato's Theaetetus does not end with Socrates providing the missing theory of knowledge. It ends, as scholars of Plato like to say, in aporia. That is to say, inconclusively. And in order to discover Plato's and Socrates' more substantive views, one must look to other writings. The Theaetetus is not, however, pointless. We have learned a great deal from it, namely that knowledge is impossible to explain on the assumption of materialism, on the assumption that matter is all there is. This is the case both on the part of the knower as well as on the part of the thing known. As we've seen, if human beings are nothing but complex conglomerations of physical parts, knowledge of truth, even true opinion, makes no sense whatsoever. And this is why Plato puts forth the idea that knowledge is only possible on the assumption that human beings have souls. In other words, that we possess a crucial immaterial component that allows us to know and understand things. Socrates' most dramatic and forthright expression of this idea comes in Plato's dialogue entitled The Phaedo, in which Socrates himself is put to death by the city of Athens. Before he drinks the poison hemlock, however, he explains to his friends and followers how it must be that the human soul, unlike the body, is immaterial, which is to say not composed of smaller parts. It follows from this as well that the human soul does not perish along with the death of the body, but is rather liberated by the body's death to carry on the function of knowledge and understanding unencumbered by the five senses, the passions, and other bodily needs that get in the way of knowledge during one's terrestrial life. But Plato's understanding of knowledge goes considerably beyond even this. In order for knowledge to be truly possible, it's not only necessary that the knower is immaterial, but also that what is known is immaterial as well. And it's for this reason that Plato's understanding of knowledge is inseparable from his understanding of reality itself, what philosophers would later come to call metaphysics. As Socrates explains in several of Plato's dialogues, human knowledge is only possible on the assumption that the things we know are not concrete or physical objects at all, but are, to use his word, immaterial forms. Take, for instance, one's knowledge of a simple mathematical truth, 2 plus 2 equals 4. No one could claim to know that 2 plus 2 equals 4, Plato would argue, without first knowing or comprehending the number 2. But the number 2 is not a physical or material thing at all. It is rather, to use his word, a form, which is to say a purely intelligible entity capable of being understood, but not, of course, capable of being seen with the eyes or perceived with any of the five senses. And yet, if one truly knows that 2 plus 2 equals 4 as an objective fact or truth, the number 2 must likewise be a really existing thing, not just some sort of useful fiction or figment of our imagination. Consider another example, namely, one's knowledge of the fact that Socrates is a human being. One could not know that unless one first grasped the form of humanity. Again, unlike individual human beings, humanity does not have physical arms, legs, internal organs, or fingernails. Humanity, like the number 2, is an immaterial entity only capable of being understood by the mind. And yet Plato insists that it is no mere concept of the mind, but a really existing thing. Plato's reasoning is as follows. If there was no objective thing as humanity, there could be no corresponding objective fact that Socrates is a human being. nor, of course, any knowledge of that fact. This leads Plato to propose that there are essentially two realms of reality: the physical realm of things that can be perceived by the senses, and the intelligible realm that can be known by the intellect. As the Theaetetus seems to show, matter, considered strictly as matter, is unintelligible and cannot be understood by the intellect. However, material things in the world participate in the forms. So your pet dog, as a physical creature, cannot be understood except to the extent that it participates in dogness, which is not itself a particular dog, but rather is what it means to be a dog. You can only know that Fido and Rover are dogs because you first know the form of dogness, because you first know, even in some obscure way, what it means to be a dog. Again, dogness is not a physical thing. You can't scratch it behind the ears, and it won't eat your garbage. It is a purely intelligible thing, the object of our understanding, not our senses. Plato also appears confident that moral realities, like justice and virtue, are also really existing forms, as well as aesthetic forms, such as beauty. Without such forms, he thinks, morally significant statements such as slavery is unjust or the Mona Lisa is beautiful would be entirely meaningless. What sense does it make to say that something is unjust if there is no such thing as justice, or that something is beautiful if there is no such thing as beauty? If there's no such thing as the form of justice, Plato thinks, statements about justice are really nothing more than statements of one's personal preference. And so the denial of forms in the moral sphere leads back to the same irrational relativism of Protagoras' assertion that man is the measure of all things, or Theaetetus' first definition of knowledge as perception. Again, as we saw before, as far as Plato's concerned, these are really just two ways of saying the same thing. Without question, Plato's philosophy is rich and complex, and in this lecture we have just barely scratched the surface of a philosopher whose thought one could spend a lifetime exploring. Inspired throughout by the life and teachings of Socrates, his thought represents a major step forward in recognizing just how inadequate the materialistic natural science of pre-Socratic philosophy is. He is, without question, the first philosophical giant, and lays a crucial part of the foundation of what would later become Thomistic philosophy.